One of my favourite things about video games that still happens to this very day is when a game becomes a breakout hit, other studios just copy it. Some have great success with this formula, iterating on ideas from the source material and making something better and unique in its own right. Take Fortnite for example, an obvious PUBG rip-off that made the game more accessible for all ages and has gone on to do ridiculously well. But then there's stuff like the Great Guiana Sisters that is such a shameless and tacky clone of Super Mario Bros. That Nintendo successfully pushed the publisher to stop selling the game. The Sonic franchise has also had its fair share of imitators, and in this video we're going to take a look at 5 of them that were also brazen enough to appear on the SEGA Mega Drive. When people think of Sonic rip-offs, Bubsy is probably the most egregious example, so it makes sense to start with it. Bubsy the Bobcat is on a mission to get back the world's yarn from an evil alien race called the Woolies who have stolen it all. It's a daft concept for a game that really isn't as bad as the reputation that precedes it. Bubsy controls well and runs around at a decent pace, but not an unmanageable one. The stages are often very explorative in nature, and you get some great satisfaction from chaining together bounces off enemies, picking up speed and momentum as you do it. Bubsy can glide in the air, giving him a way to carefully float back to the ground, and it's a nice little feature. The biggest problem with the game is the decision that ultimately ruins it, and it's Bubsy can die after a single enemy hit, which is a huge problem for a game that's about running around at top speed. Bubsy needs something to mitigate taking damage because you can't encourage players to explore when the moment they run into an enemy they can't react to, they get killed. It's a real shame because if the game had added a health bar or nicked Sonic's ring system and replaced it with yarn balls, it would be an infinitely better playing game. A real shame. Our next game is another blatant Sonic copycat that manages to avoid Bubsy's main problem of lacking a health gauge. Socket is a high-speed platformer with levels structured and designed very similarly to the roller coaster stages of the Sonic franchise, but with the addition of a melee attack for striking upcoming enemies. It's a much more successful game as a result of its health bar, and actually makes barreling through its stages quite thrilling. It's not exactly winning any awards for originality, but it's a great example of how to make a legally distinct Sonic clone that actually plays well. Capt'n Havoc doesn't resemble the high-speed action of the Sonic franchise as much as our other examples, but it does feature some elements and a character design that are clearly inspired by it. Havoc himself might as well be Sonic in pirate cosplay, and the game's use of curved landscapes and springs definitely brings Sonic to mind. But it's a much slower paced game with more emphasis on melee attacks and searching for treasure, and it helps make it stand out. It's not doing anything outstanding, but if you like platformers then it's certainly going to scratch an itch, like a well-placed hook for a hand. Now here's a game that you might even consider good if it weren't for the terribly misguided character design. Zero, the racially insensitive squirrel, wears a rising sun headband, and the title of the game refers to him as a Kamikaze squirrel. It's an image that does not belong in 2020, but here it is, and to ignore it means we learn nothing from the mistakes of the past. If someone on romhacking.net wants to change the title to Zero the Awesome Squirrel and redraw the headband so it's just a solid colour, we could salvage a pretty good game from all this because Zero has a wonderful Amiga-like presentation and gorgeous animation. It plays great as well. The characters move at a manageable pace, jumping and attacking enemies and even curling into a ball, much like Sonic. He even has a life gauge to help mitigate enemy attacks that you can't react to fast enough. But yeah, that character design. Ooh boy. And finally, the worst example of how to make a Sonic ripoff, it's Zool, a ninja from the nth dimension. Zool at least has the decency to add a health gauge to its features, but Zool is so ridiculously fast and floaty that he is a pain in the arse to control. You're constantly running into enemies or their attacks, and the level design coupled with the speed just makes this sort of stuff impossible to avoid. Also, we're back to that time-honoured tradition of British video games advertising sweets to our young impressionable minds, with Zool forcing some egregious Chupa Chups logos into its first world. Maybe that's why Zool moves at such a ridiculous speed, because he's hopped up on sweets. Maybe he vomits in the next stage and the game slows to a crawl, making for some really cutting commentary on modern consumerism.